with, it's going to tear up this church at Galatia. This conflict is so real in Galatians chapter 2, verses 11 through 21, that Paul is going to have to stand his ground, and he's going to have to stand by himself, and he's going to have to stand for what is right against those who are trying to do some things that are controversial and divisive. And Paul ain't going to stand for it. And Paul is going to have to rebuke somebody that walked with him, that he's going to mention was one of his ministry partners. And Paul going to have to even rebuke him. But then he's going to have to rebuke the leaders of the church at that time. Paul stands alone in this fight in verses 11 through 21 in chapter 2. Now, let me give you the context. You know, the book of Galatians is about these false teachers who had infiltrated the church at Galatia, and they were teaching people that you needed to be under the law and not under the grace, that salvation is by works of righteousness and keeping the law. Paul said, no, salvation is by grace through faith in Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. There's no works of righteousness in which we are saved. So that was the battle that Paul was fighting. Now, previously, Paul had a conflict with those who were of the circumcision, because those of the circumcision, which simply means those who were Jews, really didn't want to accept Titus as a legitimate Christian and a part of the Christian ministry of leadership team. And so they told Titus he needed to be circumcised, but they averted that, and they agreed that Titus did need to be circumcised even because he was a Greek. And so that conflict, it kind of settled down. But now in chapter 2, verses 11 through 21, they finna have another conflict. And I want you to, and when you read this, you're going to see just how silly this is. This is not about circumcision. This is about the fact that Peter was one time sitting down and eating with Gentiles. But because some of James and the other apostles literally shunned their nose down on that, Peter changed and got up and stopped eating with the Gentiles. Now, he was supposed to be this great Christian leader who embraced all people. Salvation is for all people, both Jew and Greek. Jew, Greek, and Gentile. Now, he was eating with them and everything was good. And then James and them called him out on it. And guess what he did? He stopped eating with them. And they were so persuasive that Paul's ministry partner, Barnabas, started acting like Peter and James and them and stopped eating with the Gentiles. And Paul had to rebuke all of them, Peter, James, and his ministry partner, Barnabas, and tell them, y'all wrong. Y'all are wrong treating these Gentiles different. Now, y'all was eating with them and everything was fine. We settled the issue with Titus. Titus was a Greek, and y'all had accepted him into the fellowship. Y'all had made the decision early that the Gentiles didn't have to be circumcised. They did not have to follow the law, and everything was good. And we were fellowshipping in this church, and everything was going good. We were sitting down having a meal, and then all of a sudden, some of these so-called big shots from Jerusalem came and called y'all out on it. And Paul says, instead of y'all standing y'all ground, y'all compromise. Especially you, Peter. If you stop eating with them, you start saying you're going to stop fellowshipping with them, because that's what literally eating is. Eating is fellowshipping. And so Paul wasn't going to stand for it. Paul says, y'all wrong. Now, I'm going to teach this lesson, but it's going to be tough. Now, look, verse 11. We're going to get into this lesson, but that's what the gist of the lesson is about. That Paul has to stand alone to call out those who act funny toward those who are of the uncircumcision, or those Gentiles. Peter was acting fine at first, and then he changed because he was easily influenced, and then they got into Barnabas's head, and Barnabas started acting funny. But what I want to tell you is Paul was courageous enough to call them all out. if he had to do it by himself and stand alone. This is a great lesson for us. When you know people ain't doing right, if you're the only one that's stand for what's right, you got to call them out. And I want you to look at what this verse is. In verse 11, when Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him. Some translation says face to face, or some translation says to his face. Paul was not going to send a text message. He was not going to send a phone call. Paul was going to confront Peter face to face. He was not going to let this slide. He was not going to send a message, write a letter, send a carrier, or use a scribe to write a letter to give it to him. Paul says, absolutely not. Listen, when Cephas or Peter came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. Paul says, I'm going to call him out because he know what he's doing is wrong. And I ain't going to stand for it. And I ain't going to let him go on doing wrong. I'm going to oppose him, but I'm going to do it to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, Peter used to eat with the Gentiles. You see that in the text? Peter used to sit down and eat with the Gentiles, and everything was fine before those certain men came from James. Peter was fine sitting down eating with the Gentiles. Let's just say we had Gentiles in here, Jews, we had old Christians and then new Christians, and they all sitting down fellowshipping together, everybody getting along, and we accept each other's differences, that you might be a Christian, but you a Jewish Christian, but I'm a Gentile Christian. You came early, but I came late, but we all getting along. Everything was fine until James and them came. Some of James, the people that knew James and them was still stuck back in that old way that you had to be circumcised or you had to be under the law, keep the law of Moses in order to be saved. And so Peter was fine until they showed up. And when they showed up, he stopped eating with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcised group. Now this fella done punked out because he was afraid of those of the circumcision. Now, as long as they wasn't around, he acted fine toward the Gentile. But when that group that he was afraid of showed up, he started acting funny. Yeah, I'm not making this up. It's right there in the text. As long as them people of the circumcision wasn't around, Peter was acting fine towards the Gentile. But as soon as those of the circumcision showed up, Peter started acting funny. And Paul wasn't going to stand for it. He called him out on it. Now, you've been sitting over there eating with them folk this whole time, and y'all had a good fellowship going. Y'all was speaking to each other. It was a friendly conversation. It was a good fellowship, and you've been acting fine. But when them folk from James of the circumcision showed up, you got up from the table and act like you didn't know them folk. And I'm telling you, and this is what he says in verse number 13. And other Jews joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy even Barnabas was led astray. And you remember it was Paul and Barnabas that started out together. In the book of Galatians, he's mentioned. And now these people done got in Barnabas' head. They done got in Peter's head, and then got in Barnabas' head. And now not only has Peter stopped eating with the Gentiles, Barnabas stopped eating with them. And Paul says, I can't believe how messy y'all is. How y'all can't speak for yourself and stand on your own conviction. That you should never let anybody influence you to treat anybody any different if you was treating them right from the start. Don't let nobody think for you. Don't let nobody tell you how to treat people that are different from you. Don't let people tell you how to treat people, period. You make your own determination. Peter made the right choice by fellowshipping and accepting the Gentile Christian. But as soon as certain men from James showed up, he started withdrawing himself and separating himself from them. And Paul noticed. And we don't know if Paul visibly noticed or if somebody went and told Paul that this was happening, but Paul wasn't having it. Paul said, this is ridiculous. And see, you know why Paul wasn't having it? Because it's going to divide and separate and threaten the fellowship when people start clicking up because of their differences. It's a threat to the fellowship. We're one body in Christ, supposed to be on one accord. And when you start clicking up in groups and telling people that they can't sit with certain people and fellowship with certain people and shouldn't have nothing to do with certain people within the same church, that church is headed for disaster. You can't do that. And it's got to be somebody among us that'll call people out and tell them that ain't right. Now look, you spoke to her, you ought to speak to him. Now you served him, you ought to serve her. Now you brought her a gift, you ought to bring everybody a gift. You don't get to select and pick people you like. We don't do that as a Christian fellowship because that's more divisive and dividing than it is unifying. And when people do stuff like that, that divides the fellowship, and you see people treating people different, and they ain't supposed to be treating them different, somebody's got to be courageous enough to call people out on their foolishness. And Paul says, I'm going to call him out. And so let me tell you how this confrontation continues. In verse 14, because and when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, when I saw they wasn't acting right, this ain't right. Paul says, I saw it. When I saw that the way they was acting toward the Gentile Christians, it wasn't right. And I love this phrase in my translation. When I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth, he said, I couldn't sit there and just let this injustice go on and let this mess go on. I couldn't do it. And so he said, I'm still in verse 14, I said to Cephas or Peter, and listen what he said, in front of what? All of them. Of them all. You see that? Paul said he didn't do it in private, and so this ain't finna be no private conversation. He got up in front of all of them, people of the circumcision, all of those Jewish Christians, and got up from the table with them Gentile Christians in front of all of them, and I'm going to call him out in front of all of them. Because what he's doing and did was not right. And I'm finna deal with it where it happened. And so this took a lot of courage that you call a person out because their behavior or conduct is not in line with the truth of the gospel. And Paul says, Peter probably went to him and said, no, you want to talk? Let's go over here. Paul said, no. I want everybody to hear this because I want everybody to see just how ridiculous your behavior is. Because you changed on a dime. Because you was eating with them folk and everything was fine. And then when them certain people from James came, you started acting different. You backed up. You separated yourself. You act like you didn't even know those people. You had a good relationship with them until the certain men showed up. And Paul told him, that ain't right. My point is this, and I'm just trying to give you some practical application. If you can treat me nice when ain't nobody around, treat me nice when everybody is around. If you can speak to me when ain't nobody around, it's just me and you, and be nice to me, do that when everybody is around. Don't act like you like me on Sunday, don't like me in a business meeting at Walmart or in a setting like this. It's across the board. You know what I'm saying? That's what honest integrity is. And so he wanted to really call him out in front of all or them all. And then he really got up in Peter's face and really challenged him to say, look, you a Jew. I'm still in the he says, you are a Jew. And yet you live like a Gentile, not a Jew. How is it then that you force the Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? And he's really saying to him, now look, don't try to make them act like you, and don't you try to act like them. Respect each other's differences. And he says, you don't want to practice Gentile customs, and you want to kind of keep some of your Jewish roots, and some of the Gentiles want to keep some of their Jewish traditions. They want to respect the message that we preach, which is the gospel, that Jesus Christ is who saves, and that's how we're saved. But they want to preserve some of their Gentile traditions, and you want to preserve some of your Gentile Jewish tradition. And so I don't understand what the problem is. Now, if you want to do some of these things that are not ceremonially, they're not wrong to do, but don't force some of these Jewish traditions on these Gentile Christians. And he's really trying to call him out on this stuff. And he says, don't force the Gentiles to follow Jewish traditions. Because now see, some Jewish Christians, they do some things that we don't do. There are some Jewish Christians that still practice some Jewish traditions that we shouldn't be forced to practice as Gentile Christians. That's fine for them. Because listen, ain't none of y'all giving up pork, so quit acting like you ain't gonna give pork. Jewish Christians still don't eat pork because it is a kosher dietary diet that they still practice. They Christian, but they still practice some of their Jewish traditions, and they don't do it for any religious reasons, but for health reasons. You see what I'm saying? Yeah, right. That's what I'm saying. There's some traditions you don't practice, you don't force them on other people, but they ain't got nothing to do with your religious standing with God or your salvation. And that's what he was trying to explain to Peter. That's fine if you want to practice some of the Jewish tradition, but don't force them on anybody else. Because the issue was circumcision. These issues were some of these laws of Moses that the